your electronic sign-ups here.
Okay. Thank you.
And then you come out and then, I actually was the last person I think who got into the meeting. I have no idea how that happened.
Hey, how are you? I'm hanging in there. How about you?
Wasn't June. It was warm.
And that is,
Yeah, there was a rainstorm during the middle of the meeting. In fact, it was, remember the thunder and the power went out a couple of times? Actually, it might have been June or July. Cause it was that big thunderstorm. Remember the thunderstorm that took the power out?
Kind of. Everything gets a little,
Whoa, a little fuzzy back there?
I know. I know. It's a good strategy.
May or may not need you, but.
Right, but it's better to have it than.
Yeah. You see, we got a second one.
No. It's not me. I'm sweating.
You give me a spot.
Good.
We're all good.
Yeah, different time, right?
Life is golden. Welcome.
Is that keeping us warm?
yes, sir. We're still waiting on
Need one more.
It's been a little crazy.
We were right, it's July.
You'll go up today?
I hope you all want
That's all you plan on doing?
Too late to fix that problem.
Right.
Years ago, we could have fixed it.
I'm out of business. I can't do form anymore. Is that? That was a day. That was a day.
Here's some.
That was great.
All right, we'll call this subcommittee to order. Just a little housekeeping today. If you're here for John Bell's House Bill 2667, that has been referred to subcommittee number 3, and that was already posted, so I'm thinking most people already knew that. So we have a sign-up list, and it looks like Delbert Plum is first on that list.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I have House Bill 2578.
2578. Draw your attention to the bill. Tell us about your bill and why we need it.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, those of you who've been around for a while, and I think most people will recognize that for years we went through a 6-year plan for secondary road planning and construction. That system now has largely been replaced by Smart Scale and the road improvement. What has effectively happened is that we have moved the 6-year secondary road monies over to these new programs as a result of legislation we passed 2 years ago. On the side of where this 6-year plan existed, you had to have a public hearing. And in my jurisdiction, that made a lot of sense because we had sometimes as much as $138 million. And we had the public come in and talk to us about how that should be prioritized. But now with the monies being shifted over to our scale and the other road improvements, we're down to $41,000. But we still have to meet the public hearing requirements, so we're only at under $38 million. So what this little bill does is simply say, if you get under $100,000, you don't have to have a public hearing.
Anybody in the audience to speak in favor of this piece of legislation?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Noel Dominguez on behalf of Fairfax County. First, I want to thank Delegate Plum for introducing this bill for us. And just right now we really are having public hearings with very little money involved. And when you mentioned the $45,000, that's actually over a 6-year period. So we're looking at maybe $5,000 a year, if that. So we are holding hearings where no money is really being involved. We have members of the public being confused on why there are hearings when there's not money to add. So that's what this bill does. It requests a hearing when it is a substantive amount. If there are any questions, we'll have you ask. Thank you.
Anyone else? We don't have a position.
Mr. Chair, we don't have a position, but we don't have any issues with the bill.
Thank you. Anyone else in the audience to speak for or against this piece of legislation? Any questions from the committee?
Mr. Chairman?
Delegate Flora.
It would appear from a quick review of the bill, Delegate Plum, that this would only apply to which counties, Fairfax? Or how would it impact other counties?
Well, I think anybody that gets funding allocation greater than $100,000. Is it just Fairfax?
No, sir. It would be for all counties with 6-year secondary road programs. I think there are very few that would fall under this $100,000.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, we counted about 22 localities, 22 counties that would fall based on the 2019 allocations that would receive a whole $100,000. Fairfax is one of them.
So I move the Cornwall EBS. Follow-up question.
Follow-up questions? Go ahead.
To whoever. So I understand Fairfax is $100,000 is not a high threshold. Would this impact other counties where this is a significant amount of money being expended, say in a calendar year that where speaking of public input would be more appropriate or?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Rock, we looked at various projects and we could find many projects that would come under $100,000. That was, of course, in Fairfax, cost may be different some other places. But even simple crosswalks, even simple small sidewalk could easily cost $200,000, $300,000. We figure $100,000 in transportation, you really
Wrong
can't.
business. Thank you.
And so, Mr. Chairman, I'll in summary just say that we don't want to raise false hopes by having a public hearing when we really don't have money to offer on projects.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? The patron? We act on.
Move to approve.
Second. Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor indicate your wishes. All right. 5-0, your bill reports. Thank you, Delby.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
All right.
I have a bill being heard in another committee, but I'm texting him right now, so. You're right, my legislation.
Okay, so we're gonna take
Please
Delegate
push that.
Jones last, Delegate Bag. Delegate Bag, tell us about your bill and why we,
I've been waiting all day to hear you say that.
hey, here I am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. This bill directs the Department of Rail and Public Transportation to evaluate cost placement, maintenance, and funding sources of signs directing passengers to Amtrak or intercity passenger rail stations. Additionally, DRPT will create an inventory of current Amtrak signs and locations and report back to the House and Senate Transportation Committees and the Secretary of Transportation at the end of this year. Currently, there is no central authority for the installation, placement, and maintenance of signs directing travelers to Virginia's 21 Amtrak stations.
All right, thank you, Delegate Bailey. I understand that there may be a substitute that you want us to take a look at.
Yes, would someone be so nice to move the substitute?
Substitutes.
We're passing that out now. And that should, that's online already.
It's getting there.
It's getting there.
It's right here.
Oh, you got
That's
this?
what I was reading from.
Oh, you.
And so just like you this morning, Mr. Chair, what I just described was a substitute.
Thank you, appreciate that. Anybody here to speak in favor of this piece of legislation?
Chris, at Department of Rail and Public Transportation, we support the amendment substitute.
Okay. All right. Anyone else to speak in favor of it? DDOT, BMD, any?
Mr. Chair, Dwayne's Maxwell can beat up and find.
Okay. So, is this what we talked about? So your substitute basically directs us to evaluate, is that correct?
Yes, it empowers them to continue to do what they're doing, but to report back to us.
Correct, okay. Any questions for the patron?
I don't see a fiscal impact. I think you've addressed it in the wording here, but just asking for the sake of, you're on the side of safety and caution.
Yeah, there's no fiscal impact. We're just asking them to continue to do what they're doing. And the only thing, if it wasn't fiscal impact, it would be gas money to bring that same information that they're gathering over to us. So it should be no fiscal impact.
Any other questions for the patron?
Or appropriate time.
All right, I'm waiting on a motion. So we have a motion to report, we have a second. With us as substituted. Bill reports 6-0.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Bill.
Let me run down there real quick. All right, back.
Yeah, so,
Generally, that's the case. My client,
you need to go.
just real quick.
Okay.
I got one up, that's all right.
Um,
2 hours, actually. Seriously, just wondering, you'll find me, just text me when we're on the last bill.
Y'all got Delaney, I think you're next. I think we're waiting for the patron.
Mr. Chairman, I have 2 bills before you today, so let me know your preference, which one.
Your preference is our preference.
Okay, maybe start with HB 2643 then.
Okay, draw your attention to 2643.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sales tax bill.
And members of the committee. So the people in my district have really made their voices heard and have come to me to express their frustration with tolling in our region. So I'm here today to stand up for them and to stand against the exorbitant tolls on I-66. While our hardworking Northern Virginians are trying to make it to their jobs in DC or surrounding areas on time, they are faced with the burden of potentially paying tolls of $40 or more. These tolls are said to encourage people to use public transit or to carpool with their neighbors, but my constituents have told me that this is not working. With $40 tolls, we are penalizing our residents in unimaginable ways. We are telling them to either choose to spend what may be half of their day's pay on a toll in order to get to work on time, or be late for the job, which may be the only source of income for their family. This is unjust and it is flat out wrong. This bill would place an upper limit on the tolls collected on I-66, capping them at $15. This solution is not perfect, and it still places a financial burden on our residents, but it ends the possibility of someone spending over $1,000 a month in tolls. So in my opinion, and in the opinion of the people that I represent, we have to put the brakes on this and relieve our residents in Northern Virginia from the exorbitant tolls on 66, and I urge the committee to support.
All right, thank you, Delegate. Do we have anyone to speak in favor of this legislation that's sitting in the audience? I know we have some opinions on the opposite side, so, Mr. Secretary?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, we did speak with Delegate Delaney about this bill. We understand the concerns that her constituents have raised with her. That being said, we have some extremely significant concerns about this legislation. I-66, this bill would apply to both inside and outside outside the beltway, just to kind of clarify which portions it applies to there. We are concerned that this legislation for inside the beltway would create a circumstance where, remember, this is an HOV roadway here. So what took place is solo drivers for the first time ever were allowed the opportunity to use this roadway during peak driving times. We are concerned that if the tolls are capped at $15, what will happen is we will fail to meet federal performance standards, and we will be forced to return this road to HOV only, which means solo drivers will no longer have the choice to choose to pay that toll and ride on that roadway. They will be legally restricted from that. We think that could be problematic because we're 1 year into the 66 Inside the Beltway project, and while there has been a lot of discussion in the media and other places expressing concerns about the toll rates, travel speeds eastbound in the morning are up 12% on I-66. They're up 19% westbound in the evening, and the parallel routes are faster or the same travel speeds as prior to tolling. With regard to outside the beltway, this would violate our PPTA deal that we announced in 2016 to widen and expand 22 miles of I-66 outside the beltway. We did that through a competitive procurement process, and the selected bidder is investing $1.5 billion of private equity into the deal based on the terms that were provided at that time. This bill would violate those terms. I'd be happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions for, go ahead, Delegate Davis.
Was this the dynamic tolling that was set up out there on the HOV lanes to allow people to use it when they don't qualify for HOV, but still desire to do so?
Correct.
Well, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Delegate Davis.
I know dynamic tolling is based on what amount do you have to charge to ensure that you don't basically cause a traffic jam and you deliver on the promise of travel, ease. If this was set at $15, would there be a reasonable expectation that price would stop the same type of traffic jams that exist on the other roads out that way, or the other lanes out that way that do not have dynamic tolling?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Davis, we believe, based on the experience we've seen in a year of working with this project, that if the toll were capped at $15, that the road would have significant amounts of congestions and we would not be able to comply with federal performance standards.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Delegate LaRocca.
Just for the record, Deputy Secretary Donahue, if my memory serves, we had similar conversations about this compensation event. Isn't it worded that it could trigger a compensation event and not would?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate LaRocca, the conversations you and I had last session regarding 66 inside the beltway exclusively, this bill has two separate enactments, and make sure Doug Delaney to correct me if I say this inaccurately. The first portion of the bill applies to 2022, which deals with only 66 inside the beltway, and the second half of the bill would amend that code section further to extend it to cover all of outside of the beltway. And in that instance, that would trigger compensation event. And unlike the question you and I had about whether or not tolling was applied on 66 inside the beltway at a certain time, this would in effect limit the tolls on 66 outside the beltway, where a private contractor through a competitive procurement has invested significant sums of money.
Thanks for clarifying.
Any other questions? Delegate Delaney, do you have a response to him, or do you want to make a comment on that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I recognize that, the bill before you isn't the perfect solution, but again, I'm hearing regularly from my constituents that the exorbitant tolls are hurting them. It's hurting their ability to get to work on time, and they're paying a significant portion in many cases of their day's wages in order just to get to work on time. So I'm hearing that message loud and clear from the people that I represent. So, putting this bill forward, I believe is a way to just put the brakes on this and recognize that these are exorbitant tolls, and we do have to take some action to relieve this financial burden on the people in Northern Virginia.
Anyone else in the audience to speak for or against this piece of legislation? Any other questions from the committee? We work on motions.
Lay the bill on the table.
Okay, we have a motion to lay the bill on the table.
Gently, I amended to gently.
We have a motion to gently lay the bill on the table. Motion fails for lack of a second.
Move to report.
We have a motion to move to report and a second, and it will be going to appropriations, if it gets out of full. So please indicate on the voting board.
Could you correct, we're voting on the original bill?
To report it to appropriations.
And
To report it to committee with the intent to go to appropriations.
yeah. Voting to appropriations, thank you.
Thank you, members of the committee.
All right.
Shall we move to the next one
Moving
now?
on. Yeah, quickly, that's good.
My next bill is 2633 for your consideration today.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Similar origin for this bill. Again, I hear from my constituents about their frustration, not only with tolls, but also with the amount of congestion.
Let me stop you there. Do you have
Yes.
a line amendment for this?
Oh, yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have that even noted here that I
All right,
meant
it's
to
a
say
simple-
that. So yes, if we
Just
could,
back, yeah, I think it's a pretty simple
hear the line amendment.
And the line amendment just inserts located and just narrows it down to planning district 8. Is
Yes,
that
Mr.
correct?
Chairman, this does simply narrow this to planning district 8.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
if you get a motion for the amendment, to adopt
Move the amendment.
Okay, all right. All in favor of adopting the amendment? All right, we are, the amendment is before us and the amended bill is before us now. Let's go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So again, I hear regularly from my constituents about their frustrations about traffic and congestion in Northern Virginia. It is a real serious problem, facing the Commonwealth, but especially in Northern Virginia. And as our region's population and our economy continues to grow, vehicular traffic will also continue to grow beyond what we've even seen so far. So the residents of these areas, especially in Northern Virginia, do struggle to travel throughout the region in a reasonable and sensible time. As the Commonwealth continues to grow, I believe we need solutions to keep our congestion on popular roadways low. So this bill before you would prioritize projects that are unlikely to increase congestion over those that would increase congestion through the smart scale process. So by giving precedence to projects that do not contribute to congestion problem, the bill would encourage transportation projects that do not create additional delays in an area where it is already difficult or near impossible to get to work or home in a reasonable time frame.
Okay, Delegate Davis, you have a pressing question. Go ahead.
Yes, sir, and I'm just, because I'm kind of interested, can you give me an example? Because I'm just having a hard time where they would put precedence of a project that would increase congestion and one that wouldn't. What's an example of that one?
So, and I'm sure that some of the folks that are here to speak to the bill could, possibly give some examples of specific projects in the past. My intent with this is to simply say that if they are choosing between two projects, there may be elements of a particular project that could perhaps benefit a certain development or a project in a certain way, but it's actually compounding congestion. And so what I intend to accomplish with this bill is to look at our prioritization from a complete congestion mitigation standpoint.
Any other questions from the committee for the delegate? Delegate LaRocque.
Actually, I guess, see who comes to speak.
Okay, all right, let's do that and let's back up. Anyone here in favor of the, would like to speak in favor of the bill? Anyone here would like to speak against or have concerns about this bill?
Mr. Chairman, Nick Donahue, Deputy Secretary of Transportation. We have talked with Delegate Delaney about this legislation. We completely understand the intent that her bill is seeking to strive, and I think generally that reflects current law today, which requires congestion mitigation to be the highest rated factor in both Northern Virginia and the Hampton Roads region. So currently, out of 100 points a project could possibly get, 45 of those in both those districts would come from congestion. We do have some concerns regarding the legislation that could have some unintended impacts. So for example, I believe someone asked about a potential project and how it has happened. An example I might cite would be the Lawyers Road project in Northern Virginia, where we had a problem with people driving at excessive speeds that was resulting in significant accidents and injuries. We implemented a project that reduced excessive speeding on that roadway by, I believe, 13%, but the really important thing is it also cut crashes by 2/3. So in that instance, under the technical definition, there's actually more delay there because people are not driving as fast as they were, but that was the intent of that project because it helped make that roadway safer. And so again, we understand that congestion mitigation is the top priority in North Virginia. The board's current policy, as well as the Code of Virginia, reflects that, and we're just concerned that the legislation may have some unintended implications.
Any questions for Delegate LaRock?
So question for the Deputy Secretary. I'll make a statement and ask you to correct me if I'm wrong. Currently, scoring in Northern Virginia puts a significantly higher weight on congestion relief, but my understanding is that doesn't obligate the Commonwealth Transportation Board to select that project. It just advises them. So if I read this right, this would obligate them to prioritize congestion relief, or as it's worded here, and prevent them from selecting a project as opposed to making it permissive as it is now.
Mr. Chairman, Delegate LaRock, the way the CTV policy, as well as some of the reforms that were put in place in the 2017 session, which is 33.2, 214.1, or 2, excuse me, along with board policy, it requires the staff for the Commonwealth Transportation Board, that's myself and others, when we put together the policy to fund the highest scoring projects relative to the benefits they provide to cost, and put that out as the draft recommendations for the board, at least 150 days prior to the board's action, so that the board can see that, and then the board can make any changes as required by that law enacted in 2017 to vote in public to make any types of changes. So in a way, I think you were kind of saying the board can really pick anything it wants. That is an accurate statement, but I would say the way the process works, both by law and the adopted board policy, is that we put out the highest scoring projects. They're there for a period of public comment and review by the board. The board then can change from that and select another project, but that must be done by an affirmative vote of the board in a public setting. And again, the concern here is that taking away any discretion might stop them from implementing a project that may have real safety benefits but could result in slower speeds, which may be the intent of a project.
Sure.
This would take away that discretion? Question mark?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate LaRock, that is our reading of the language. I will say I had to read the language a few times, so I'm open to understanding it differently, but my understanding of that is it says we cannot choose to fund any project that may result in increased congestion or delay over any project that would have any congestion or delay reduction. And so a project like Lawyers Road, where travel speeds were reduced, but crashes were also reduced by 2/3 because that had some increase in congestion or delay, as it would be, that project could not be selected for funding if there was any project that had any reduction in delay anywhere else in Planning District 8.
Any other questions for the committee? Anyone else in the audience to speak in favor or against this piece of legislation?
Good afternoon, Pollard with the Southern Law Center. Although it's absolutely critical to address congestion, as Deputy Secretary Dunn mentioned, it's already the top criterion in this region. Our concern is the unintended consequences. Deputy Secretary mentioned safety projects. We're also worried about some economic development projects, such as redevelopment, say, of a shopping center that adds a stoplight. As this reads, that project could not move forward and promote smarter roads, especially in Delaware-Delaney's part of the world. We just think it's very important to promote both safety and revitalization. Talked to the delegate about this. I totally understand what she's trying to do, and just the way it has unintended consequences that also would impact some projects that she also would very much like.
Do you have the same concerns?
I don't disagree that the stoplight could be interpreted as creating more delay, which then would prohibit the board from considering funding that if there were another project that hadn't been funded that had any delay reduction, sir.
Okay. Any other questions from the patron? Or anyone to speak in favor or against this piece of legislation?
Move to report.
Second. A motion and a second to report House Bill 2633. As amended.
Is it a move? Are you moving?
No, we'll move as amended.
Okay.
Yes, sorry, Mr. Chairman, report with the amendment.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and
Wait,
members
wait,
of the
wait, wait,
committee.
wait, wait. Okay, your bill does report.
Oh, no, couldn't change that.
No, it's just my thing was a
What is it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
All right, thank you. Okay.
This one's the first one to come down.
Delegate Hodges, step right up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Actually, I do have an amendment. I typed it up myself. Hot off the press.
Okay.
Fairly simple.
Let's let council look at.
It's scary. Not in Latin abbreviation.
All right, so are you get a copy of that?
No.
Yeah, let's
Yeah,
give us
it
just,
works, but
just
I
give
can
us just
I
a
can
minute,
if you want. That works.
Okay, great. Did you make a copy for everyone?
I don't know how many I've got here, but. What? I can share, I've got. How many maybe? If that's in the proper order, if that works.
Would you be willing to sign this?
I can sign.
I just handwritten, just so we can autograph a copy.
You don't want to read.
Do you have one additional copy, sir?
Actually, good enough. And I've got a couple more. And if I may, Mr. Chairman, you want me to continue or? You don't need
Let's see if, wait till she gets it loaded
Okay.
up and gets it public, and we'll go from there.
Would you any more successful than I was?
I was, but I had a one word change.
Oh.
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Hodges, if you're amenable to it, I would suggest adding in parentheses item 1995, section 33.2-1800 at 6. Mr. Chairman, would you like me to report the
That would be
amendment?
great. Can you do that? Thank you.
Absolutely. On line 10, after the word shall, strike solicit and accept proposals, and insert evaluate the feasibility of using the Public-Private Transportation Act of 1995, section 33.2-1800 at C.
Does anybody have any questions about the amendment that's before you? Everybody have a copy of it or I've seen it? Okay. We adopt the amendment. Okay, let's move the amendment. We have a second.
Second.
Thank you. Okay. All right, so,
Steve Landis is now texting me, like, why don't you open your interviews?
okay, let's go ahead, Keith. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Many of you are familiar with, between the Middle Peninsula and the Northern Neck. If you've ever driven down there, you've either driven across the Downing Bridge between Tappahannock and the Northern Neck, or the Norris Bridge, which is probably the one everyone talks about, which is almost 10,000 feet long, very high, very narrow, low sides, and I will tell you, my wife, I hate to say that, Mr. Secretary, she won't drive over it, you know, to this day. And, you know, it's actually on the critical infrastructure list, top 25 critical infrastructure list to be replaced in the Commonwealth of Virginia at a cost of roughly $300 million for only 8,200 cars a day. Without either one of those bridges, you're looking at over an 80-mile detour, and it's critical to the economies of both of those regions where we suffer for jobs each and every day. Over 74% of the region drives out of the region, either to the Northern Virginia, Richmond, or Hampton roads each and every day to work. So without these bridges, look at the commute you would have. It would absolutely be devastating to the region. But what we're looking for is trying to find a way to solve this problem, and looking at, you know, the Public-Private Partnership Act, to get the private sector involved and develop solutions for this problem. So very very simple. It just opens that up. Initially, it said they shall solicit and accept, but when you solicit and accept that, that means VDOT has to do it. Of course, there's no funding, but this just really opens it up to be able to solve that problem.
Anybody here? Go ahead, Delegate Reed.
So, with the CPB, do we have to specify in code which ones can use the public-private partnership or not?
Not that I know of, not that there. What we're just saying is VDOT, we're sending a signal, there's a huge public outcry to solve this problem, and we've only been trying to get VDOT to put on their economic development hat and say, look, guys, we need to look at an alternative way to solve this. We really need it, it's critical for the economy in that region.
Any other questions from the patrons? Let's go ahead and get the Deputy Secretary up here to talk about his thoughts on this.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Nick Donahue, Deputy Secretary of Transportation. I want to thank Delegate Hodges. We did work on this language with him. We had some concerns with the initial legislation. When we shall solicit and shall accept, that means people can give us really bad deals and we must accept them. We don't like those types of deals in the Commonwealth. I think what the delegates bill, this new posture would do would ask us to evaluate whether or not there's some opportunities. He is correct, the North Bridge is on our, what we call vital infrastructure list. It is a very, very large structure that will be very, very expensive to fix. And I think we are open looking at all options to help us address that. There's also some legislation in the Senate that may come your way that would look at some other ways to do that as well. So we have worked with the patron on this legislation and we have no issues.
Okay, great, thank you. Delegate Reed.
So, to the Deputy Secretary, so is this the process that we want to use going forward as far as helping you prioritize the list of projects, is have individual delegates say we want to make this a priority as opposed to something else?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Reed, I would say that this does not direct the board to expend funds to construct a project. So from my perspective, I don't think this is telling us we must go build this project. I think my understanding from the discussions I've had with the patron is we want to understand if there are opportunities under the Public-Private Transportation Act that could allow us to advance this. I think the reason I would say that's slightly different than I think the framework you laid out there is typically under the Public-Private Transportation Act, there is some sort of revenue stream that would then be leveraged to help fund that improvement. And so I think the way I would view this is what we're being asked to do over the interim between this session and next session is evaluate whether or not there are opportunities for revenue streams related to these two bridges to help fund their reconstruction and replacement.
Delegate Barak.
Mr. Chairman, could you elaborate on revenue stream? Like, what are we looking at hypothetically?
Mr. Chairman, they could be a mix of things. Traditionally, the Commonwealth has been tolls and it has also been property taxes and other things. So for example, on Dulles Rail, there are special property tax districts, I believe both special assessments as well as tax increment financing that have been used for that. And I believe what the patron is asking us to do is to evaluate what those opportunities may be for these two facilities.
Similar to I-81 study, on a much smaller scale?
I don't think that is an unfair assessment.
But not a study. But not a study.
Yes, we know what the project is, those two bridges.
Any other questions?
Move to report.
Second. As amended? So we have a motion to report as amended and a second. Please indicate on the voting board.
The emails worked.
Get on that.
And your bill reports 7-0.
All right.
Thank you,
members.
Delegate
Thank you, Mr.
Hodges.
Chairman.
I know you all are gonna be upset about this, but I just got word from Delegate Torian that he's requesting that we strike this bill.
Move to go forward. You want to take that up now?
Yeah, we can go ahead and do that now, if that's okay with you, Bob. So we have a motion to strike this bill as requested by him. Delegate LaRock has made the motion to strike. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay. Please indicate on the board. And his bill has been struck. All right. Okay, so in front of us now, we have Delegate Hugo, who has two pieces of legislation.
All right, Mr. Chairman.
Which one do you want to do first?
Let's see, Mr. Chairman, let us see here. And I think, if I might
House Bill 2527.
2527, dealing with tolling in Planning District 8.
And with the suggestion and with the astute help of our friends at McDonough at VDOT, I have a substitute, I think.
All right, we have the, do you have a substitute? Okay, so we have a substitute, or you just gonna read it?
I'll report it,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, it can be a line amendment.
Okay.
On lines 31 and 32, strike, all the new language that's after Romanet 3, and insert any primary highway that is wholly located in Planning District 8, classified as a secondary highway, and that is between 30 and 35 miles in length. I have additional copies of that language.
Okay, get this distributed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ron, you need that? We have a motion to adopt the substitute.
So moved.
Second. We have a motion and a second. All in favor of adopting the substitute, say aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
So your bill is, with the substitute is in front of us now. Let's talk about it.
Mr. Chairman, one second. Deputy Secretary Donahue was saying it's previously classified as a secondary highway, and I apologize. Yeah, cool.
Okay.
Maximum.
That will still be on line 30, or Mr. Chairman, on line 31 of the new substituted language, after 8, insert previously.
Okay. So we need to adopt that as well. So can we get a motion to adopt the new language for the new substitute? So we have a motion to adopt the language. We have a second. All in favor of adopting that? All right, so go ahead, Delegate Hugo.
Mr. Chairman, working with all y'all in the committee, one of the things we've done over the last few years, tolls are part of the solution that we deal with, but we want to make sure they don't get carried away. And I think some areas there's been a tendency or people want to use them a little too much. What this bill does, simply, initially it was saying no new tolls in Planning District 8. With this cutback, that would have impacted certain other things that probably didn't need to be done and have been problematic for other areas. What this does is impact, like I said, anything that's previously classified as a secondary highway between 30 and 35 miles. That probably, two things I'm thinking of, the Fairfax County Parkway and the Prince William Parkway, that just happen to fit in that criteria. So, because there has been discussions, not necessarily by VDOT, our friends at VDOT, but by some of the localities, there's been discussion to toll these roads. These roads go through neighborhoods. They're roads that everybody uses, but I think to toll them, in addition to toll 66, 395, 95, I think would be problematic. It'd be a little beyond the pale. So what this just says, if we're going to do that, that they have to come back to the General Assembly to get approval. So I would hope that, again, tolls are a tool and part of the solution to our transportation problems and roads across the Commonwealth, but we can't see them as a panacea to be used willy-nilly. I appreciate y'all taking the time to listen to me today. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions for Delegate LaRock?
It seems obvious, but
Sure.
just to be clear. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if a road is 29 miles long, it wouldn't be affected by this bill, or if it was 36 miles long, it would not be affected by this bill. Are we creating a bracket and only impacting those roads that fall within that bracket? Thank you.
It's bracket might be a harsh term, but it's a parameter.
Parameter.
A parameter.
Move to accept the, move to report. So we, that's sort of rushing along here.
Yeah, I appreciate your brevity.
Enthusiasm.
I appreciate your enthusiasm.
Yes, let's hear from the audience. Anyone in the audience would like to speak for or against this piece of legislation? Okay, that's good. We have a motion to report, and we have a second, as amended with the 2 amendments. We have a motion and a second. All in favor of this piece of legislation, please indicate your vote. Everybody voted? All right, 7-0.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right.
And I should have said that those two roads run through a bipartisan collection of delegate districts. So
I'm sure Planning District 8.
I am.
We shall see.
Okay, let's on to House Bill
Yeah, it's
2511.
I thought we'd all get together, give pizza chance, and,
House Bill 2511 is before us.
next, laugh about it. Next one, Mr. Chairman, House Bill 2511.
Okay, dealing with hot lanes on I-66. Any amendments to this piece of legislation? Okay, all right, let's hear about it.
So here's the situation. They've implemented these hot lanes, and they've, on 66 going in. And I think there's an effort, it was a good faith effort to try to do this. Again, for a lot of our constituents, live outside the Beltway, it's an interesting dilemma. If you live outside the Beltway, and you're going east, you pay the toll in the morning, and then you pay the toll in the afternoon. If you happen to be living inside and going west, you don't pay the toll in the morning, and you don't pay the toll in the afternoon. You know, I'm not necessarily wanting to get in that fight, but I think there's a problem there, and the disparity. I think that a lot of our constituents face, it's problematic. Again, if you're coming from Washington D.C., you don't pay the toll. If you're going west and going back home in the afternoon. That being said, one of the other things that my constituents brought to me is, in addition to this disparity on the tolling, depending on where you live, they've expanded the hours. It used to be, and you're not supposed to do this, I'll never admit it, but it used to be people would come and they would crawl right up to the interstate at 5:30 in the afternoon and wait for the hot lanes to open up and get on it. And they'd do the same thing in the morning. They would try to jump on right before, hope that they made it there. But they expanded the hours that this tolling is implemented. The problem with that, now people are having to get up even earlier in the morning to try to avoid these tolls, and then also having to stay later at work. Really what this does, it literally just takes us back to the hours that were in place for many years prior to, I guess 3 years ago, a few years ago, when they put this new tolling plan in place. I think it's fair. I think for the families, if you're a family, a mother or a father, having to get up that much earlier or that much late, come home that much later in the afternoon, it's just problematic. So I would hope that this legislation will be considered, and I appreciate that. Just like I said, it's pretty simple. It literally reverts the hours to what they were for decades.
Any questions for Delegate Reed?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just so that we kind of all know where
Yes, sir.
we are now, what are the hours in the morning and in the evening? Because I know that you're trying to get it back to where we were, but what are we looking at right now?
I think in the morning it's 5:30 to 9:30. Deputy Donahue, correct me if I'm incorrect on that. And this legislation would change the operating hours of the hot lanes to 6:30 to 9, which is what it was back AM eastbound. So if you're going from your house east, and 4 to 6:30 going westbound on 66.
And what is it currently?
Go ahead, Delegate Reed.
What is it currently now, Secretary Donahue, the afternoon time?
In the afternoon, the operation hours are 3 to 7 a.m.
So it's a much broader window now than it was before.
Delegate Davis?
Just a point of clarification, because I'm not driving up there that often on 66. Those lanes, would they then go from not being told to HOV use or not being told to general use?
I'm sorry, I apologize.
The lanes, would they go from not being told during these changed hours to HOV only use, or would they go from not being told to general access use? Okay.
Delegate LaRock?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is probably a question for the Deputy Secretary.
He's available.
I haven't gone anywhere.
I thought he's throwing me a lifeline, but I don't think he likes the bill. But he's smarter than I am, so I appreciate him being here.
Delegate LaRock?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in last year's budget, there was an amendment that proposed tolling reverse commuters in the same time brackets. If that were to be proposed, or well, it has been proposed, and if that were to go forward, would this amendment impact that in any way?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Rock, this amendment would not, because this applies in specific directions to specific counties.
Delegate?
Secretary Donahue, does this in any way adversely affect federal funds that the state is getting for the purposes of these roads or any other roads in the state of Virginia?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Reed, and I hope at some point there'll also be an unknown from the audience to speak as
Yes,
well on these matters.
we got-
This would not impact any federal funds, this change. I have some other remarks I'll make at the appropriate time.
And you can feel free to do those now since you're standing there.
Mr. Chairman, Nick Donahue, Deputy Secretary of Transportation. Again, I spoke with Delegate Hugo. The administration does oppose this legislation. I understand the items and issues that Delegate Hugo has raised here. What we had previously, and again, the products that's been implemented, I think it's really important to understand, is a result of a study that started under the McDonnell administration, which recognized that, as Delegate Hugo noted, you had a lot of individuals that raced to use this roadway before the old HOV hours. And so what often happened in the morning is people would get on with the inaccurate, either knowingly or unknowingly thing at 6:29. The HOV hours kicked in at 6:30, and so many people did that you had congestion on 66 into the Beltway well past 7 a.m. Again, and so that was a time period where we were trying to move more people through incentivizing carpoolage and doing other things there. And so that is why the hours were expanded. That planning study identified that to create a functioning system, you needed that broader period of time that related to the function of the rush hour period there. In addition, we are concerned that constricting the hours will actually result in an outcome that I think Delegate Hugo and others who've been before you today have expressed that they don't want to see, which is higher tolls. That may seem counterintuitive, so please just bear with me for a second as I try and explain that. The reason the tolls go up, as Delegate Davis noted earlier, is they're dynamically priced. VDOT does not decide that Tuesday at 8:15 we're going to make it whatever the other amount might be. It's that a certain number of single drivers are saying, I want to use this roadway. They're seeing the price continue to go up, and they are still making the decision that I wish to use this roadway. And so again, it's the demand that drives the price, because under federal rules, we're required to have free flow traffic on this HOV roadway. And so by compressing the carpooling use, which has expanded out over this window from 2.5 hours to 4 hours, and pushing it back to 2.5 hours, there will be less space available during those 2.5 hours for solo drivers. Similarly, you have solo drivers who are now using the roadway at 6 in the morning, paying a toll, I believe, on average is under $2, that are getting high free flow travel speeds. We believe that you'll also compress the solo driver usage of this roadway into the time where it's functioning better because of the management through the hot lanes. And so you'll have less space available for solo drivers, more solo drivers that wish to use that. Under the law of supply and demand, that means that the rate that will be available to ensure free flow would be higher.
Delegate Reed.
So a question to the Deputy Secretary. So are you saying that by putting these hours back to where people were used to having them for years, that we could see tolls higher than $46.70 that we've already seen?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Reed, I always am reluctant to predict the future. What I'm telling you is that the way the tolls work in this system is that there are carpool vehicles that are inelastic demand in this system. Right now, those carpool vehicles are spread out over a 4-hour period. If you compress those carpool vehicles into a 2.5-hour period, which one would assume they would do because they want to use the roadway when they get the benefits of faster travel from carpooling, that will then reduce the amount of space that's available for solo drivers. I don't believe we'll be reducing the demand for solo drivers to use this roadway. In fact, I think you'll actually have a more concentrated demand because there'll be less time when the roadway is functioning. So you'll have less space available for solo drivers to choose to use, and you'll have more solo drivers that wish to do so. And under the law of supply and demand, if what I'm saying happens, I believe you'll see higher tolls.
Follow question. You mentioned when you were referencing that underneath federal guidelines, we as a Commonwealth are required to make sure that the traffic flows through this corridor at a certain rate. What happens if we don't make that happen? This goes back to my original question about how does this impact us potentially getting federal funds either for this road? How does the federal government then enforce that?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Reed, as I responded earlier, it would not impact federal funds. What would happen, and this is under Section 166 of Title 23, the federal government would come kind of read us the riot act for a period of time, and then if we are unable to cure, in effect, the issues they've identified, which again is being over 45 miles per hour 90% of the time, and I would note that we currently do drop to 40 miles an hour at the height of rush hour when some of these high tolls that have been referenced are seen, just to give you a sense of the demand there. They would prohibit us from allowing solo drivers from using this road. And so those solo drivers today who are making the choice to pay these toll rates, which again vary, would not have the flexibility to make that choice to pay to use a road they've decided to use. They instead would be on Route 50.
Delegate Hugo, would you like to
appreciate it. I know that Nick Donnie's my friend, and he said he wasn't gonna make a prediction, but he turned around and did it anyway. But that's okay. That's okay. But I'm just saying, I think he's making a faulty assumption. I think he's assuming all these people, you know, that I say that I'm worried about that are on the road, that have had to change their lives, use the tolling hours, and they'll really continue to do it. What's happened is people are refusing to pay $40 an hour, or excuse me, $40 a ride. So what they're doing, so instead of getting up into the old hours at 6:30 or getting on at 6 and going through and doing their business, they're now having to get up at 4, 5:30. They're having to get up at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. Turn around the same thing in the afternoon. They're having to come home after 7 o'clock at night. So if people want to pay the tolls in the middle, that's fine. But what we're saying, those people, that is the prime time. And if you want to pay it, and look, I've paid it before, and sometimes I've cried afterwards when I've seen how much it was. But if I had to get there. But for the families that are going, if you're saying going from our area to the Pentagon, or our area to DC, now you're having to get up, and you can't afford $30 or $40 on a toll. Then what you're doing, instead of, he's assuming you're gonna ride, what they're doing, they're just getting up earlier. And now they're coming home later, and they're seeing their kids later. So this worked for years. I think it's an opportunity to go back. I'm not trying to, I'm trying to kind of split it in half. I'm not trying to eliminate the tolls. I think that'd be might be good politics, but it'd be political grandstanding. I think it'd be counterproductive. Really trying to find something to kind of a measured approach for these families who are literally coming to me and saying, man, I can't afford $40, each way. Can you imagine paying it each way if you get stuck with that? Or $20 or even 15. But my life has changed because now I'm getting up earlier and I'm leaving my kids earlier and dropping them off with somebody earlier to get them to school. And now I'm coming home later. And now, the 15-year-old's having to fix dinner instead of, me doing it. So I think this is really, hopefully, I thought is a measured way to do it. See if we can get something that I think is good for our people. I didn't like the fact that the tolling was one way, that basically our people get stuck with it. If you're coming from DC, don't. And I asked Secretary Lane about it. He said, well, that was just I think it was the deal they cut with Arlington and DC. I thoroughly disagree with it. I can't fight everything. Yeah, I can't fight everything. But I think this is a one-way, kind of a measured step to try to help our families. So I appreciate it. Y'all
Just
very gracious.
for the secretary. So, Mr. Secretary, I just want to make sure I've kind of got this right. So I understand what Doug Hugo is saying. There's elasticity of demand. Basically, people are getting up earlier now because they don't want to pay that $40 toll. And what you're saying is those that want to pay the toll, do not have traffic congestion, they will not leave as early as they do today. They will wait for it to go later to have access to paying the toll. But that assumes that they can adjust their work schedules. Is that availability for those people really as elastic as it is in the opposite direction where Delegate Hugo is talking about? Everyone can get up earlier before they go to work. Can they really wait longer to go to work in that area?
Mr. Chairman, I think both make certain assumptions about work hours, but I would say that the average toll before 6:30 is not $40. So I think we're actually debating this under a premise that isn't what we're seeing on the ground. The average toll before 6:30 is under $2. The peak toll of $40 that we see in the headlines that the Washington Post might make you think every solo driver who chooses, and I stress the word choose, to use 66 is paying, happens at 8:30 in the morning when this road is not available otherwise to solo drivers. And so this $40 toll, again, no one's paying that at 6, no one's paying that at 5:30, no one's paying that at 9:15. That is a toll that happens at the height of rush hour. The average round trip toll on I-66 that is paid is $12.59. That's $8 and change in the morning, and it's $4.50 in the afternoon. I'd also stress that 2/3 of users of I-66 actually pay no toll because they're carpooling and riding transit. And so again, the main goal of this project is to move more people through an extremely difficult corridor. This is the only road like this in America where it's been restricted to HOV use only in the morning. When you get into DC, it comes at a stoplight with the Kennedy Center on the left and the National Mall on the right. So as much as we in Virginia would like to say we're going to widen this road, there's a red light at the end. It's green for 30 seconds and then it's red for 30 seconds. So I respectfully say there are only limited numbers of things that being done here. And finally, I would just say is, we have run analysis about what are the comparable travel times on the free arterial roadways from 5:30 to 6:30. And if you're coming from Northern Fairfax or from Loudon, it is actually faster to not use 66 and to take the GW Parkway in than it was to use I-66 before these hours expanded, because there was so much traffic congestion. If you're coming from central Fairfax or Prince William County, using the Beltway and Route 50 is approximately 2 minutes longer than using I-66 was prior to the implementation of these tolling. So folks are not being forced with the premise of paying $40 at 6 a.m. or spending an extra hour on the road. There are in fact faster options, and the toll is less than $2.
Mr. Chairman, congestion mitigation pricing can be an effective tool when it has its place. But I went on the tollway here in Richmond the other day. I think I paid $1 or something like that. Can you imagine paying your constituents, you're paying $12, $15, not even 40. You know, some people can't swallow 12 or 15 or even $20. I did it the other day, and it was like, $20. You know, can you imagine doing it down in Norfolk at home? We're getting there. Yeah, I know. But this is what's common.
Yeah.
And I think there's gotta be, I'm just saying, I'm not against tolling. I'm not trying to ban it, but I'm just saying, for our constituents, I think there should be some parameters, some limitations, because if not, you're gonna get carried away with it, and I think our people are gonna suffer. So, y'all been very generous.
So, we got a couple of questions. Hold on, I got one.
Oh, yes, sir.
One quick question for Nick. So, we talked about this before last year. One of the challenges I know from talking with folks in Northern Virginia, even though I don't represent the area, is what we and I talked about, which is you've got tolls, and then you've got increasing real estate taxes, and then you have increasing insurance because of the increasing real estate taxes, and then you have increasing stormwater fees on top of the increasing real estate taxes, on top of the increases it's getting to the point where people are saying, I gotta look further and further and further out west, and then for the people that are inside the Beltway. So is there anything that can be done from what WUGO is trying to do to try and mitigate some of these costs and help some folks up that way?
Mr. Chairman, that's a very good question, and I'd like to bring up some issues I raised at the Joint Commission on Transportation Accountability. When Secretary Valentine was before you all, I believe her 3rd or 4th day in office last year, she committed to taking a look at the toll rates and taking steps to reduce those. We have been implementing those steps at the department, and we have seen reductions in toll rates of 10 to 20% between 6:45 and 7:45. What we have also found, though, is that our ability to reduce these toll rates that happen at the height of rush hour when the roadway was previously restricted to solo drivers, which is the $40 that's being mentioned here, because of the high level of HOV penetration and because of the high level of demand to travel in at that peak hour, there's very little that we can do. But again, Mr. Chairman, I would remind you, the toll before 6:30 is less than $2. When the toll has hit $40 is at 8:30 in the morning at the peak of rush hour when the road was previously not available to these drivers. And so again, those are people who are now making a new choice, availing themselves of a new option to use a road that previously would have been illegal for them to use.
So follow-up question then would be, are you finding, because we talked about this before, I know it's not germane to this bill, but we and I talked about some of the other roads we looked at in the Commonwealth on tolling issues, and I think one of the concerns is, are you finding people who used to use 66 or use 66 for a certain point, but then they say, I've got to get off, I got to take a secondary and third road, so now because of these increasing toll fees?
Mr. Chairman, that's a great question. So one of the things we've done on this roadway, and I think this has been one of the most transparently implemented projects in the Commonwealth, is we've published monthly performance reports on I-66, expresslanes.org, where you can actually, by 15-minute increments, evaluate the speed on parallel roadways compared to before tolling and after tolling. And what we have found is that all the parallel routes are actually performing faster since the implementation of tolling, or at the same speed, with one extremely mild exception, which is the George Washington Parkway headed eastbound in the morning, where it is 0.1 mile per hour slower than the year before tolling. However, Mr. Chairman, I should note that the reason for that is because the roadway has been under construction since June, and they actually reduced the speed limit from 50 miles per hour to 35.
Mr. Chairman, let me get this and get you out of here, because most of you don't live in Northern Virginia, you really don't care. So, a couple of y'all do.
I care when I'm riding.
But it's
We all
not fair.
care about that one.
Thank y'all.
Mr. Chairman, can I make a motion?
I'm feeling the love.
Make a motion to report.
Second. We have a motion report, we have a second. Please indicate on the electronic voting one. This will go appropriations from the full committee. Right, okay?
Is there a letter?
Your bill reports,
Y'all been very gracious, thank y'all for your time.
Thank you.
Hope y'all had time, tolls involved with that.
They're different when they suck.
All right.
Thank you. All right, so we are down to Delegate Ferris.
Did you just send that out with all this discussion? You wanna go first?
Oh, okay, you just in here, I'm sorry.
Delegate Ferris.
Yes, sir.
It just sounds like.
House Bill 2212 amends, section of code, gates across private roads, leaving gates open. And what it deals with, Mr. Chairman, and what my intentions are, is that when there is a, right-of-way, it cannot be blocked just for the simple reason of blocking it if it's at the edge of a property. In other words, the gate and the fence would have to serve a purpose other than to block that right-of-way. And what brought this case on is I had a constituent that had a right-of-way and it went along the edge of his neighbor's property, and his neighbor put a gate up, said he was fencing the deer out of his grapevines, but it blocked the road and there was no grapevines in the road, and that was the road was the end of his property.
Question for a deer was blocking grapevines.
Keep the deer from eating the
Oh,
grapevine.
great, okay. So he had put the barrier up to keep the deer from eating the grapevine.
That was
Okay.
his.
Was it an effective, I'm sorry,
No,
was it an effective barrier?
Yeah, he had a big tall chain link.
Okay. That's your bill.
Yes, sir.
All right. Anyone in the audience to speak?
For now.
For now, yes, sir. Anyone in the audience to speak in favor of this piece of legislation? Anyone in the audience that has concerns about this piece of legislation? Are there any questions from the committee?
Question.
Delegate Davis.
Just, I don't know how you define any person. We had an issue with local right-of-ways where the government owned a right-of-way. Would this apply there, or is person really defined as what we would lay people define as you and I? Or can a person be the local government?
A person could be, it would be the land, we'd be talking about whoever owns the land and whoever owns the easement. That could be an entity or an individual. Person would include corporations, local government.
Thank you.
Yep, Delegate.
Yeah, so, Mr. Chairman, so this is not something that local government can take care of? There are no laws that, or policies that would guide, could be used as guidance for this? This is, you know, I certainly don't wanna vote on something, then you hear somebody and shot somebody on, because of,
This is on private property.
okay.
Oh, okay.
So, but still there are no, excuse me, Mr. Chair, so there are no local policies that would address this even on private property. Something's on my private property, someone put something on my private property. I can call the police department or whoever who would go to then that person who's placed something there, or either I remove it myself, place something there and say, okay, this is her property, you can't do that.
Mr. Chairman, I tell the delegate that this is dealing with right-of-ways that cross, say if I'm crossing this table to get to the chairman.
Okay.
And you own this table.
Mm-hmm.
If my right-of-way is right here on the edge of your property,
Mm-hmm.
the only reason you would put the gate and block
It's
the
because
right
my property
is
there.
because my road is on the edge of your
Of your
property.
property, okay.
The only
Okay.
reason you would put that gate there is to
Mhm.
maliciously keep me from traveling in that right of way. It's not serving any purpose, cause you're certainly not growing any crops or anything in that road.
Delegate Mieres.
So do you pretty much qualify this as a private property rights bill? You don't have to get permission to put up this kind of gate. I'm just trying to be, have a clear understanding.
No, yes, you'd have to get the permission, you're exactly right, you would have to get the permission from, Mr. Chairman. Let's ask.
Yeah, I think Emma may be able to clarify, because I think it does change the burden of proof, so.
Mr. Chairman, so we're under existing law, if you're the person who has the easement, the landowner, so it's a situation where somebody has an easement over somebody else's land. The landowner has a gate that goes up to either side of the easement, or a fence that goes up to either side of the easement. They are allowed by current law to put a gate in across the easement in that
Okay.
situation. In order for the person with the easement to have there be changes to that gate, they petition the court, and then the person with the easement needs to prove that the gate was willfully and maliciously erected. What we do in this situation is we say that that
would
you would
change it.
still need to petition the court
Okay.
in order to make a change to the gate, but it removes the requirement that the petitioner prove that the
So
erection of the
the
gate
burden
was.
of proof shifts.
The burden of, yes. It removes the element of proving that it was willful and malicious. They
So-
would still, now what would be is that the court could require the landowner who put up the gate in the first place. The language of the code is to make such changes as may be necessary and reasonable in the use of such roads for both the landowner and the petitioner.
Delegate Mieres.
Well, I mean, easement by nature is essentially a property right a third party has over another on a piece of land, essentially. But the burden is in case if I have an easement right on someone's suburban property, then at that point, if they erect a gate, then the burden is on me who has the right to the easement, then petition the court, and I'm saying where the law is now. And I have to prove, the burden also on me to prove that barrier was erected, the standard is willfully maliciously, is that correct? And what this would do would remove, they are allowed to erect the barrier, but I'm a little bit, so the burden then shifts, this burden stays on the person with the easement rights?
Correct, that person would still be the petitioner.
Okay.
And so the typical burden of proof, in civil cases would apply. And so the remedy,
Should be
the court
preponderance
would
of the
have, correct, and then the court would have the option to make changes that it deems to be reasonable and necessary. Or to order the landowner to make changes that it deems reasonable and necessary.
Just in layman's terms really quick, if I have a piece of property and I have a fence that crosses over into Delegate Mieres' right of way, because he's got the land right next to him. In the status quo, he's gonna prove that I did this willfully and maliciously to get me to take it down off of his property.
But this is a race.
In the status quo. And going forward, he doesn't have to prove I put it up willfully and maliciously. If my fence crosses into his property, he can petition the court to have me take it down because it's on his property.
So in a way, does this not actually limit your property rights? I mean, you have two competing interests. You have the property owner and that person who has the easement rights, which is essentially a property right section of the property, the main property. So what you're telling me is we'd be getting rid of the burden upon the property of the person with the easement right. Oh my gosh, this is.
No, we'd be. Delegate Jones.
I have a question for you.
For the other attorney here.
And I say this friendly to Delegate Ferris, but I'm listening to Delegate Mieres and it sounds like I'm back in law school and I'm wondering whether this is even something that this
Flashbacks.
committee should be considering, whether it should be for civil sub to consider.
Yeah, it's the will of the committee.
I'm not forcing that issue, I'm just throwing it out.
I second that.
But the problem is I serve.
Is that a motion?
I have to hear it.
That's a motion, I second it.
There is a point of clarification, but that's not what we're having.
Be civil sub, be court, but
Delegate Mieres.
well, I'm not speaking on behalf of the chairman of civil sub. I want to be clear. my understanding is you may have already had all the meetings of civil sub. There may be an additional one, but I am not gonna speak for them. I think yesterday was our last civil sub meeting, so.
And we've not received a letter for this anywhere.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion to refer to this justice.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second.
Oh, yeah, I'm talking Mr. Chairman, I
You
can
can
take
put it on everybody else and said they just didn't want to touch it.
So we have a motion and a second to refer, House Bill 2212 to, Courts Committee.
Was it Daniel in the Bible that they threw the line?
Yeah. Well, we're not that bad, are we? We have that bad of a
Daniel?
Question.
I'm mad.
Yes, Delegate Rock.
I'm mad. Not Daniel,
However
okay.
we act on this, if it is still alive when it leaves us today, and I hope it is,
Why?
whose discretion will be applied to where it is rooted? We can make a
Why?
recommendation, but if someone else decides to send this to, say, a general laws or some other place that perhaps doesn't.
Don't send it to the law.
It's our recommendation.
No, it's in the session is the attorneys need to get hold of that, it needs to be
To
court.
answer Kelly Rock's question, wherever, if the full committee accepts the recommendation of the subcommittee and the full committee refers it to another committee, then, it is then it is then to that committee. And it's up to them to act on it.
And our full committee meets Tuesday? And will there be an opportunity for courts to hear this
Courts
after
can,
Tuesday?
well, we could potentially hear it on Monday.
Yeah, sure.
No, because we have, full transportation will have to meet first, refer it out to committee prior to.
And that's up to Tuesday.
Because
I had one earlier.
I came from my best friend when I brought this.
Delegate Rock.
Could this subcommittee refer it to civil courts, or does it have to?
No, it's gotta go to the
Got it full.
That's good, the full committee's gonna decide.
There's sort of a gate that blocks us from moving.
So, we have a motion and a second on the floor to refer this to court, even though we don't know if that's the death knell of this.
It is what it is, Mr. Chairman, 400 years, we've had a chance to fix this.
Substitute motion? We have a substitute motion by Delegate Davis.
To the extent that, we have a couple attorneys here and we can give them time to figure this out for the rest of
No.
transportation.
Oh, I'm not an attorney yet.
Yeah, I knew that we report.
Don't make Jay and I relive
And
property
they
law.
can figure it out.
Okay, so we have a substitute motion to report,
We have to have the first motion, withdrawn.
okay, so are you, is Delegate Jones,
So what's my motion?
Delegate Reed, are you willing to withdraw your first motion?
What's the substitute
The
motion?
substitute motion is to refer it to the full committee.
And let Jason and Jay take care of it?
Or our chairman, one of the two.
I'm so excited that
Yeah.
I was just like,
I'll
chairman.
withdraw.
Okay, so the original motion is withdrawn, we now have a substitute motion on the floor to, report,
Why did we withdraw?
Or chairman, Billy, needs to take it out.
to report, this, House Bill 2212 to full committee. Is there a there is a second, please indicate on the electronic voting.
I'm not voting yes.
Ferris, I have
I
voted
have
no.
too many questions
I'm sorry.
that I need to, I'm voting no because of my questions.
Same.
Same. I'm just.
David said.
Yeah.
I'm sure you'll
He
remember
also
that,
doomed
right?
you too. Okay, so the bill reports 4-3 to full committee. I would definitely be there, Delegate Ferris.
Was it the cattle guard that got this sent to transportation?
Mr. Chairman, it is in, 33.2. Actually, the provisions about the cattle guard are in Title 55, which would have been opposite.
Thank you, Delegate Ferris.
Thank
So we
you,
have
Mr.
one more
Chairman.
piece of legislation, I believe, is that correct? Emma? And that's, from a member of our committee, our subcommittee, and that's, House Bill 2489, Delegate Jones. We have a substitute. Yeah, okay. We have a substitute, we're gonna pass that out, get that in front of you and adopt that. You have it?
Yes, I do.
Okay. so the substitute in front of you, we can get a motion to, okay, we have a motion to adopt the substitute, and we have a second. All in favor of adopting the substitute, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the bill as substituted is in front of you. Delegate Jones, tell us why we need your bill.
Certainly, thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2489 seeks to suspend toll collection in affected areas during mandatory evacuation. And this situation arose back in the fall in Hampton Roads, where I'm from. We had a near-miss hurricane which forced the governor to issue a mandatory evacuation. I will say, as a fourth-generation Wofokian, this is the first time my parents ever decided to leave the area. It actually moved off, but really the only way to go to get out of the storm path was west. And so to go west from where I'm from, you've got to go through two tolled tunnels to get out of Norfolk to go west, although they're not on technical evacuation routes. But these tolls certainly affected folks where I'm from who had to leave, who don't have easy passes, who don't normally use the tolls because they're just too prohibitive to get through for them. And so we got significant feedback from constituents over the course of the fall about these charges that they had to incur through no fault of their own. And so this legislation seeks to alleviate some pressure that they're getting from the toll companies down there. This really does apply statewide. I know there's a couple of carve-outs in the substitute that will not affect the PPTAs that are in effect for certain other projects, but I think after hearing from my constituents over and over again, not just after this hurricane, but since I've been in office, about 40 or 45% of my constituent work is related to complaints related to tolls. I think this is a step in the right direction to work with the Commissioner of the Highways during mandatory evacs, and that's limited to just that particular situation.
Any questions? Delegate Reed.
Yes, so does this only apply during the evacuation and not during the return?
The suspension applies for the duration of the mandatory evac. So you can come back before, you can come back after. It might be a one-way, depends on how long you go, how long you leave. I would say that, I can just tell you from experience, I'll give you some data here. We are a little bit of a different tolling situation than Virginia. You can either have an easy pass that's registered, and that gives you one rate, or you can have an unregistered easy pass that gives you another rate, and then you can pay by the plate. A lot of the folks who contacted my office are folks who don't have an easy pass because they can't afford it and they don't drive through this tunnel. And it gets up to about $5.75 at peak hours if you're going out. And that can really put a hurt on you. I've seen so many folks who have been decimated and crippled by these tolls. They end up in collections. It's really the working poor and the folks who are hurting the most. I'm fortunate enough to be able to pay these tolls, but a lot of the people that I represent really got hit pretty hard. Again, in a situation in which they were forced to leave through no fault of their own, but a natural disaster to the extent that there really could really been the big one for which we are long overdue.
Delegate Reed,
But the follow-up, Mr. Chairman, thank you, is the expectation is that the evacuation could be terminated and they could be out of the area, and then as they get back, they're gonna have to pay tolls or take an alternate route to get back. And that would just happen as a normal course of doing business.
Mr. Chairman, I would say to Delegate Reed that I think that might be a certain situation. It is my sort of understanding, and I've been talking to Secretary Donahue about this, that the mandatory evacs can last for a little bit longer than one would assume. And the state's emergency lasts far longer, so that's what it's limited to mandatory evacs. So my hope is that people would get back in before. There's no provision here that would provide that even if you don't get back in, you don't have to pay that second
So
back
that
leg.
they couldn't have to pay.
But only one leg.
Yeah.
Delegate McClain.
A question for the secretary, and this is just, if there's a mandatory evacuation, why would we be charging people a toll anyway, we're just trying to get everybody out of Dodge? That looked like it to me that would have been a part of the mandatory evacuation to shut everything down, because we just want people to head west or wherever they're heading to get out of Dodge. And so why would we do anything to be slowing the process down? And maybe it wasn't thought about, I don't know.
Deputy Secretary.
Donahue, Deputy Secretary of Transportation, Mr. Chairman, the language today has a permissive authority for the Commissioner of Highways to exercise this authority. He has exercised this authority. I think the issue, and when there have been evacuations, I think the issue that Delegate Jones is raising is in the future when these events happen, this bill would place kind of an affirmative requirement on the commissioner to designate those routes that they believe in those events based on the circumstances of a particular storm which routes are critical for evacuation to facilitate that out there. In the past, because it was discretionary authority, again, the commissioner exercised it. At times, people did not always understand why it was exercised. This would make it very clear that the expectation is you will, and you will explain why.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I would add to Delegate McClellan to answer your question. I mean, the reason that these tunnels exist where we are is because of a terrible deal 6 or 7 years ago that was not transparent, that was part of the process that we have since changed. But we are still stuck with this down on Hampton Roads. And unfortunately, we live in an area in which these natural disasters affect us regularly and far too often. And so in places where these people need to go on these routes to get out, a lot of times it's the working poor. And these toll collection companies, I believe, are getting rich on their backs.
So have they ever suspended the tolls?
That might be a question for.
Mr. Chairman, McDonough, I don't know the answer to that question. I know the commissioner has suspended tolls on certain facilities. Whether he has ever done it on the Elizabeth River Tunnel since the reimposition of tolls on that facility, I don't know the answer. I'd be happy to try and figure that out before full committee.
Okay. You're not aware of them ever suspending tolls?
I'm not aware of them being suspended. I do recall, Mr. Chairman, that during the hurricane, I think the Chesapeake Expressor, which is owned by the city of Chesapeake, they lifted their tolls voluntarily as Good Samaritans, but that was not the case for the other facilities.
Okay, Delegate Davis.
Just a quick question for Secretary Donahue and then for the delegate. Secretary, we do have the ability, the commissioner does have the ability, if they so desire, especially in situations like this, to suspend all tolls, correct?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Davis, the commissioner has the authority for any roadway that is operated by, owned by the Commonwealth. And what I'm trying to say is there's a few that we do not have that on. So for example, in Delegate LaRocque's district or in his area, the Dulles Greenway is an entirely privately owned facility. We have absolutely no authority over their toll operations. Similarly, the Jordan Bridge down between, I believe, Portsmouth and Chesapeake also is a fully privately owned facility. There was a special piece of legislation that was enacted in 2008 or 2009. It's a Section 1 bill that fully governs their roles, and I don't believe under that the commissioner was given any authority, but otherwise, yes.
And follow Mr.
Delegate Davis.
And the other delegate, I like this, and I think this is definitely a priority, there's no doubt. The only question I have is, have you thought about the state of emergency period, not the evacuation? I only say that because we have a lot of people, like you said, the working poor, and I'd hate for them to wait a little longer so they don't get caught up in this quagmire of the tolls. And everyone complains to you and I and Delegate Miyares about the $5 becoming $50 very quickly. The state of emergency wouldn't require them to sit there in place and provide more congestion only because they're waiting for that period.
Mr. Chairman, I would say to Delegate Davis, we did consider that, but it can be the case that states of emergency can last for months. And because we're pulling down federal dollars during these situations, and so mandatory evacuation is a much more narrow and defined period. Certainly, I don't think the toll companies would miss the money, but we want to make sure that we're not sort of leaving it open-ended unnecessarily.
Thank you. Chairman Yancey. So quick question for you. Obviously I'm just here to fill in, but I'm listening to the debate. Did ERC weigh in? HRTPO, HR TAC, any of those groups?
I think a couple of them.
Trying to get
Oh,
here.
well,
Let's-
okay,
well,
wait a minute,
just
just
take
take
it.
it.
I'm just curious. Delegate, okay, so, let's get some, okay. Anybody else in the audience to speak in favor of this piece of legislation? Anyone in the audience concerned about this piece of legislation or opposed to this piece of legislation? Okay. Any other questions from the committee?
Is there fiscal impact to this? Is this going to trigger an event where there would have to be compensation of a concessionaire?
Delegate Jones?
Mr. Chairman, I would say to Delegate LaRocque, and I would ask Secretary Donahue to come up here as well, but I think there are certain agreements that, again, I wholly disagree with them, but it does require the state to put some into on the back end.
Mr. Chairman, Delegate LaRocque, to the question that's been kind of raised here, there are provisions in the comprehensive agreements that would allow for the suspension of the tolls under emergencies and other circumstances. For example, in Northern Virginia, some of you may recall last year we had this wonderful wind event when the Potomac Yard sign fell over sideways and blocked all southbound lanes of I-95 for a period of time. In that event, the commissioner exercised his discretionary authority to require Transurban to waive the tolls in the hot lanes, because otherwise there would not have been a general purpose lane heading south. So again, our agreements contain those provisions. This language has been drafted to recognize that our comprehensive agreements do in fact have, some have unique and slightly different steps, but this recognizes the existence of those comprehensive agreements and would function within them.
Delegate Rude.
Quick follow-up.
Okay, sure, Delegate, let's do a follow-up real quick.
If I think you've answered the question, but waiving means not being compensated for after they've waived the tolls.
That is my understanding, yes, sir.
Thank you.
Delegate Reed?
And I guess that was the question, I was just gonna try to clarify Delegate LaRock's question, is that there's not an obligation from the state to have to pay this back later.
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Reed, that is correct, my understanding. Again, I'm 99% certain. I think to Delegate Jones's point earlier, if this were something that were several months long, and not a zombie apocalypse, which who knows what would happen then, but under just a typical state of emergency that lasted for months, I think that there could be issues, but when we have a specific, unique emergency event, like a sign blocking all southbound lanes on I-95 or a hurricane evacuation that are discrete and time limited, my understanding is there is not compensation that would be required.
Mr. Clevitt?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rick Clement with Hunting, Andrews Kurth, for ERC, Elizabeth River Crossings, to clarify under the comprehensive agreement with that toll facility and the way the substitute is presented, there would be no obligation for the state or any other third party to reimburse ERC. This would be an event that's recognized in the comprehensive agreement.
I have a question. Do you know of any time that during an emergency that you suspended, your agency suspended the tolls?
No, the question came up last year during the hurricane that hit that area, but the tunnels weren't identified as an evacuation route. This legislation would help that situation like that.
Thank you very much. Anyone else to speak about this piece of legislation? Delegate Mieres?
Comment and motion, Mr. Chairman?
All right.
I have to say that's the first time in my short legislative career I've heard the reference to the zombie apocalypse in a committee meeting, and also motion report.
We have a motion to report as substituted, and we have a second. Indicate our votes on the electronic voting tablet. And this piece of legislation advances 7-0 to full committee, and thank you for advocating for the less fortunate